Welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. I am super excited about today's episode. I got to catch up with my friend and former colleague, Dr. Liz Kaylees. We worked together at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences as postdocs, and we were both working on camera trap research. I was pretty surprised to learn that Liz is the lead renewable energy scientist for the North American region of the Nature Conservancy, which is awesome. I'm so proud of her. And we had so much fun talking about what she does as the lead scientist. And when we first met, we were both working on projects that had to do with camera traps and therefore wildlife. And we bring it full circle today, talking about how her job, even though she's working on renewable energy today, really has a lot to do with wildlife and the impacts of solar and wind on wildlife, and what the Nature Conservancy is doing to advocate for these renewable energy sources using real science, but then also looking at mitigating some of the conflicts that can come into play with wildlife and habitat. You're going to learn so much about this today. She was also the director of science for the North Carolina chapter of Nature Conservancy. We'll talk about what she did as the director of science there, the chief scientist overseeing science across the state, and as well as what it's like to work for a nonprofit, especially the Nature Conservancy. Liz is also the mother of three children, and we talk about how she had children while pursuing her career and some of the things that she did so that she could both be a professional scientist and a mom. I had so much fun talking to Liz. She offers some really great tips for students, and I just know you're going to love this conversation. So let's just jump right into it. Hi, Liz. Welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
It's great to see you again. We used to work together, which I'm sure we'll end up touching on, but it's yeah, really nice to be able to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. So last time I saw you, you actually gave a talk at the museum, and you were then the director of science for the North Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Is that the correct
Yep.
title?
Yes, that's my past role. Yep.
Mhm. Now you're in a position of lead renewable energy scientist for the whole Nature Conservancy, correct?
For the North America region. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, because we also have a global level. It's very confusing.
Well, North America is a pretty big area, so that's fantastic. So why don't we start off with telling everyone about your position today, what you do, and what it's like to be you on a daily basis in your job.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if I could, I may just touch on where I started at the North Carolina
Yeah.
chapter because it really led into my current role. I was at the North Carolina chapter for about 8 years. And my role there was to basically ensure that everything we did at the chapter level in North Carolina was informed by sound science. And so the Nature Conservancy, we're primarily a land trust. We buy and we protect and we restore land. And that's one of our major strategies. And we've been around for 70 years. And we're the world's largest and oldest land trust, the largest conservation NGO. So, the idea though is that we are entirely science-based. And so it was my job in North Carolina to make sure we had that scientific foundation when we're doing climate adapted forestry, when we're doing carbon sequestration in peatlands, when we're doing longleaf pine restoration. I would ensure that, we're basing our management on our actions on good science. The other half of my job was looking out ahead to say, well, what's coming down the pike? What are new challenges and new opportunities in the conservation world? And that was probably the part of the job I really liked the most because I could say, what are we going to do about forest carbon? What are we going to do about climate adaptation? It was really exciting. Felt very, topical and relevant. And so one of those things in North Carolina was solar development. And this was roughly 2017-ish. We were actually the number 2 state in the country in the amount of installed solar capacity. So just after California, which is huge. So we had this crazy amount of solar here in North Carolina, and there are obvious potential conflicts with wildlife and land use. And it just really fascinated me. So I started working with industry, really chasing that question of, can we have clean energy, which of course is really important for climate mitigation, but also have the land we need for wildlife, can we set aside land for protection, avoid the best lands, and make sure there isn't a conflict here? And can we make this win-win, basically? So, in chasing that question of solar development, I just started working more and more in renewable energy. Loved it. Just thought it was a really cool application of a lot of the wildlife things I had learned as part of my training. And eventually, we needed a full time scientist position at the North America level in the renewable energy team. So, I've been there about now a year and a half.
Cool. You mentioned that a lot of people, when they think about solar energy or renewable energy, they automatically think that it's great, and it is definitely. But there are, like you mentioned, some conflicts with wildlife and habitat. And I think that some people might be surprised to hear that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and that was the learning curve I went through as well. We want to support this climate solution, and here we are, number 2 in the country in North Carolina, and so that was really exciting, and we were a leader in this space, right? So we wanted to support that. And what we realized is there are ways we can support that sort of development. So development generally, of course, the Nature Conservancy is not supportive of, but here's something that we're holding up as a climate solution. So how do we justify converting, thousands of acres of land from whatever it was before, and I'll get to that, into what is essentially an energy generation facility with probably mowed grass, a chain link fence, and they can be, hundreds, if not thousands of acres. What we had to figure out is, can we get behind this, or under what conditions can we get behind this? Like everything, it wasn't black and white. We fell back on the mitigation hierarchy, which is our common approach to development, which means step one and the first priority is good siting. So can we avoid natural areas with high biodiversity and put solar in other places? So we're big advocates of putting it on degraded lands, mine lands, et cetera. The second step is that, okay, once you've sited it well, what can you do at the site to minimize impacts to wildlife and biodiversity? And so that's where you can talk about vegetation management and how to design these solar facilities. And then the third step is offset. If you really can't avoid, let's say, cutting down forests, can you plant some forest over here? We don't really like to get to the offset stage. We want to deal with avoid and minimize. And so we learned that we actually can support the rapid deployment of solar by following that strategy. And what our role is in the transition is to really help industry understand where are the places to avoid, like provide good siting maps, and then also provide good management practices for how to run these solar facilities so they can provide things like wildlife habitat. They can, again, minimize those impacts. So potentially, yes, there's a huge land use conflict. We're converting thousands of acres, but what we're learning is that we can actually make these two things work. We can have natural areas and we can have solar if we put some thought into it. And the key here is taking this time now before the transition has begun, but taking a moment now to pause and say, let's do thoughtful planning based on good science and not make some of the mistakes we've made in the past was, developing without that sort of thoughtful
Mhm.
consideration up front about trade-offs and complementary values in the landscape.
How does that work? Do you, as a representative of the Nature Conservancy, approach a company and you know that they're thinking about building an installation of solar panels and mitigate before that happens? Or are you involved with the government somehow planning these solar panels? How exactly does the process work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that we spent a lot of time on because how can we effectively influence, right? Can we do it at a scale where it's effective? Me going to every solar developer in North Carolina and talking to them one on one is not a very scalable solution. And so a lot of that I did, I do work directly with developers, but a lot of that is also to learn what are they doing, to test practices. I could talk more about, practices on site to try to make sites more compatible with wildlife. So there is the direct one-on-one as we both kind of learn and use adaptive management to improve these sites for wildlife. But the Nature Conservancy at a national level tries to provide tools. So a siting map, we have a tool called Site Renewables Right, which is a web map that portrays conservation data. So layers in the map that show you where is the bat habitat, where is the game, where are waterfowl. And so we can help developers by using, they can use our map to say, where are these areas of potential wildlife conflict? And hopefully what that means is they can early on either avoid those places or do the ground truthing to make sure there aren't conflicts at the site. And that does a couple things. I mean, obviously it avoids harming biodiversity, it avoids converting habitat. But what it can also do is avoid conflicts with local stakeholders because people who are living near these facilities care about wildlife and care about, whether or not these facilities are going to be detrimental to the environment. So by identifying these conflicts early, you can get your stakeholders on board. You can make sure there's no harm to the environment. And that can actually help speed up solar deployment because even though it sounds counterintuitive, But by finding the right places where the permitting process will happen quickly and you're not going to get stakeholder pushback, you can actually see projects go through more quickly and, not get hung up with a lot of permitting delays and costly, resubmissions of permits, et cetera. So the Nature Conservancy is very committed to helping speed up this energy transition, but speed it up in a way that's safe and responsible, not just for the environment, but also for communities. We're very engaged in empowering communities and making sure community benefit agreements help the local communities who, may also be experiencing losses of jobs due to the energy transition. So we're very cognizant of both the conservation and the community angle on this transition.
Why would stakeholders be against it? Is it because of that loss of job aspect of it?
Well, not specifically. Some communities are experiencing a loss of jobs, let's say to coal mining, et cetera. So we have communities, they're called energy communities, and they're delineated in federal legislation that may be interested in seeing these jobs and in projects come to their communities. You can't really predict what a community wants, right? That's the tricky thing. And it's not up to us to say what a community wants. So you may find that a community is very receptive because they want to see the jobs and the property taxes, et cetera. Or you may find that there's a community that doesn't like it for aesthetic reasons, that's concerned about, like I mentioned, the wildlife impacts. I think we're all learning collectively, the NGOs, the agencies, and industry, the space, is that every community is different and you need to engage directly with them in order to figure out what incentives they need or what appeals to them or what doesn't appeal to them. So community benefit agreements are agreements that often come with like a financial contribution to the community. What is important to you? What does your community need? And can some of the proceeds from some of the investment in that facility go directly to the community for their benefit?
Yeah. Okay, let's take a step back. How did you enter this field in general? Take me back to when you were a child, if that happened. What inspired you to go down the science route?
So, yeah, great question, because I think a lot about a concept I read about just in the last couple of years. It was in a book, you've probably heard of it, called Range by David Epstein. And apparently most people, when they talk about their career path, say, oh, my career path is non-traditional. It was really circuitous and like, this would
Mhm.
never happen again. And actually more people have that message than they do, oh, I locked in from day one and I always want to be the
Mhm.
same thing. I try not to start, my career talk by saying like, this was really atypical and circuitous, because I think that's part of the process to figuring out what it is you really wanna do, right? I mean, you don't
Yeah.
know what you wanna do. If you think you know what you wanna do when you're 10, it's probably because you've only heard of, like, 15 jobs. And I think I got that from another book. Another really great book on this is called Think Again by Adam Grant. And this idea that, if you decide you wanna be a doctor when you're 10, that's great, and maybe you really do wanna be a doctor. Or did you kinda lock yourself in early on, maybe without ever having explored your options? Maybe, a parent
Mhm.
pressured you, whatever. So I do feel like it took me a little while to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. At the same time, my husband laughs at me when I say that, because I, basically majored in environmental science in college, and here I am doing environmental science. So it hasn't been that crazy, but I did start off wanting to be a marine biologist. And it started from when I was in the fourth grade. We had an animal report that we had to do, and I did mine on sharks. And back in the 80s, when I was a kid, sharks were not viewed as an animal that was worthy of sympathy, right? This was still in the
Yeah.
Jaws era. And so for me, it was really cool to be the champion of this underappreciated and vilified animal. So I kind of carried that with me, and it got me more. I didn't quite realize I was actually more interested in conservation than I was strictly marine biology. But when I went to college, I didn't want to lock myself in quite yet. So I majored in biology and ended up majoring in a version of environmental science. Again, in the 90s, that wasn't
Mhm.
completely a thing, but I majored in environmental science, but always kind of knew I wanted to go to grad school. Like I will now contradict myself, because I always wanted to get a PhD. I didn't really have a great reason. I just always really thought it'd be
Yeah.
cool to get a PhD. Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know where that idea came from exactly, but I wanted to be Dr. Kaylee. So when I finished with undergrad, I actually went out and was in the private sector for a little while. I did environmental consulting, but eventually I knew I wanted to get back to grad school, and ended up for my PhD studying out west at Northern Arizona University. I studied forest restoration treatments and wildfire and the impacts on small mammals. And I was really interested in mammals at this point, because during my master's degree at Yale, I worked with a PhD student who did small mammal trapping. And to me, it was just such a tangible way of seeing the impacts of
Mhm.
habitat perturbation. She was looking at how different forest treatments were affecting small mammals, which is practically what I ended up doing in my PhD, just in a very different system with a different question. But I just thought it was such a tangible, applicable result. I felt like it was real conservation. We could actually talk about animal populations and communities and how they're being impacted by these forest treatments. So for my PhD, like I said, I didn't really have an end goal. I didn't have something, it wasn't like a thoughtful process where I said, this degree will get me this job.
Hmm.
But I kind of went more with the idea that, if you enjoy something, and again, I think I got this from another book somewhere, that if you enjoy the process, don't worry so much about the outcome. That if you enjoy something, you're going to be good at it. If you're good at it, you're going to enjoy it. And that will ultimately lead to success and good things. So I kind of just rolled with it. And when I finished my PhD, as a lot of people, I think, in graduate programs, felt like the next logical step was to try to be a professor, right? You just sort of, you get sucked into the idea that in academia, that's the end goal. But what happened around that time is that my husband and I and our kids were pretty little at the time, moved to North Carolina for other reasons. And I ended up job hunting for a solid, like nearly 4 years, a solid 3 years at least. Not sitting at home that whole time. I was doing various part-time as a postdoc at the Museum of Natural Sciences in
Hmm.
Raleigh. I taught a class at Duke. I actually worked for a large pesticide company for almost a year, which was a permanent job, but I decided the culture was not for me. So I
Was that
do,
before the museum?
yeah, it was
Oh, I
actually,
don't think I realized that.
and I had little kids and it was like corporate
Yeah.
culture. It was a little too much. And then I thought, well, maybe what I'd like to do is more part-time work. Maybe I should focus on my kids, but work kind of in a part-time capacity. At the time, I
Hmm.
was doing a lot of modeling and data analysis, which I could do from home. So this is the period in my life where I think I was doing that exploration, right? So I wasn't just locked into one thing. I was really trying different temporary jobs and trying different experiences. And I think the thing that kept sticking with me was I liked it when my work was applied. I liked it when there was a conservation
Hmm.
outcome. I liked working at the museum because we're working with, on mammal conservation. So I kept, and actually when I was at Northern Arizona University, the research I was doing was under the auspices of the Ecological Restoration Institute, which it was pretty much its mission is to make sure that forest restoration is happening across the West in order to prevent catastrophic wildfire. So those sorts of jobs really appealed to me along the way. And so that was the thread I was looking for, where eventually that led me to Nature Conservancy.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised you didn't become a professor because you were so into quantitative stuff and modeling, and you were just so sciencey. I thought you would have been such a great a professor. I mean, you have an amazing job now, but
Yeah.
I just thought you would take that route.
That's a huge compliment. Thanks. I didn't realize I was so sciencey. Yeah. But
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I was always well at the museum. So Liz would do a lot of really complex modeling. I mean, you and like Ariel would like kind of invent models, correct? I don't
well,
even know what you guys are talking about. Some
I viewed myself, it's funny, right? Because you always view, the imposter syndrome. Like I always viewed myself as sort of a hack, like I felt like I kind of carved, I was doing, yes, you're right. I was doing all like, I was
yeah.
in R all day long doing data analysis and a lot, data processing, data analysis. But I always felt like, yeah, I didn't, I was still never like the statistician. I was very good at pulling things from different places and making it work for that practical application, right? So I
Mhm.
think the theme was still there. Like I like to see outcomes that were meaningful and got us, interesting results. And yeah, there was a period there where I said, well, with little kids at home, maybe, doing modeling stuff, because this was before COVID when it wasn't as
Mhm.
normal to work from home. I was like, hi, this kind of work from home niche where I can pick up kind of short-term gigs where I do the data analysis from my computer. And, maybe that's my job. Like maybe that's a really good way to have work-life balance. And, I was pretty content with that actually. But then the Nature Conservancy caught me by surprise. I had a lot of friends in grad school who really wanted to work for a nonprofit and, we're very much looking at that as the track they were interested in. And it really just never occurred to me. I don't know why. I guess I don't think I saw a lot of nonprofits as having a lot of science, depth
Mhm.
in scientists. And the Nature Conservancy is a little bit unique in that sense. But what happened was actually, I'll tell the longer version of the story, is that I actually applied twice. I applied to my job as the director of science early on when I first moved to North Carolina, and I didn't get it. And I could have been resentful, right? I could have
Yeah.
been, like, I hate the Nature Conservancy, but I really liked them. I really liked everybody I interviewed with.
Mm.
I was really intrigued. I'm like, wow, that was a really cool job. I didn't even know I wanted it until I didn't get it. And I was like, wow, like that seemed to really check all my boxes. That's really a shame.
Uh-huh.
So that was in the back of my head. And then the exact same position opened up, I think it was 2 or 3 years later. The person who had, gotten the job instead of me moved on to another position within the
Mhm.
Nature Conservancy, and I applied again. Not sure how that was going to go. I'm like, well, they've already rejected me once. Maybe this is lame. And this is definitely some advice I like to give to younger people who are
Yeah.
applying to jobs and interviewing. I think I viewed not getting a job as a rejection, right? Like you didn't get the job, you're no good at this. But the people interviewing you view that as like, wow, you almost got that job. You were good enough to invite to our final round
Yeah.
of interviews, and we put hours of our time into you, and we view you as like a really awesome candidate. So to flip it around and be like, I almost got that job, I was good enough to almost do it, to me really changed my thinking. And so I applied again at the Nature Conservancy with that in mind. And I think partly through all my interviewing, I had actually built up my network within this area, within the Raleigh Durham Chapel Hill area. I knew a lot more people. I was connected with NC State, of course. And then I worked at Duke for a semester. So I had this network now from just being in the area and doing all this interviewing and networking. And so it kind of all came together, and I finally got the job at the Nature Conservancy. And it truly has been, it's actually exceeded expectations. It's really been amazing. Because again, I am a scientist, but I can actually see the impacts of what I do playing out on the ground. Not always, right? There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that you feel like, oh, it didn't really quite get us there. But I'm less focused on publications and more focused on what can we implement and how can we make an impact.
I love that. And yeah, like I just never heard you talk about nonprofit jobs. And the applied aspect was always really important for me. And I would get frustrated like doing academic work because I loved it. And like it was, really cool to publish and stuff. But I did get frustrated that I would do this like huge project and then nothing would really happen. Like you'd get a publication and some people talking about it, but that was it. And I love that attitude about you're so right about that you almost got a job. I was talking to somebody who hired people, and he was telling me about this time when 2 candidates, they were, like, both equally amazing, and he's like, "It literally like, we literally had to, like, do kind of like a coin flip because it was so they were both so qualified for the position." So just because you don't get a job doesn't mean, again, that you're rejected, that you almost got it. I love that.
Yeah, that those people, yeah, think very highly of you as a result. So you can actually leverage that, right? You can use that.
So you love working at the Nature Conservancy because it's very science-based. That seems to be your motivator, very science-based and applied. Can you talk about what kind of science projects you managed and what was it like to be on like the manager end of things? Or were you conducting research as well or strictly
Yeah.
managing?
No, yeah, you're right on. It's a mix, right? So in my current job, so I'll talk a little more about the renewable energy role I'm in now. Then we work on wind as well as solar. My depth is in solar, but I also work on wind now. So it was great because I got to focus entirely on renewable energy, but I'm always learning new things, which is another thing I really love is that
Mhm.
we're trying to keep pace with what's actually happening, out in the real world. And so that means wind as well as solar. I'm investigating a few other, mini projects around geothermal, around hydrogen, around carbon storage. So it's really fun because it is sort of a little bit of a make it yourself job about identifying priorities and then figuring out what do we need to know in terms of, what do we base our strategies on and then what kind of work do we go after. So back to wind and solar, part of my job is that direct implementation, right? So making sure that we have good science to support the tools and the reports and the guidance that we're putting out into the world and particularly to industry in this space. And so, as mentioned, like that site renewables right tool, we're actually, and you can Google this. And right now it's the Midwest and sort of the Great Plains, like the middle of the country, because it was all about wind 10 years ago. That was, the main focus. And then we expanded it to solar. And now we're going to expand it to be nationwide. So my job as the scientist on the project is to make sure we have the best data, right? So I'm trying to figure out what kind of data do we need? What kind of values are we trying to portray? We're working the social side as well. So what kind of social, can we map social values? So that's the role of the scientists. And as well as, of course, I have this amazing team of people who think more about the strategy side, the communication side, doing the actual technology, making this have good usability, good functionality for the people using it. So we have a whole team of people whose skills all complement each other. But yeah, my role is to say like, what do we need from a scientific perspective? And so that is more on the, dissemination and outward facing side. The other part of my job, which again, this is all, these are decisions I make about what is the balance that we're trying to strike and what's really needed. I still do engage in actual research, trying to understand the impacts of solar and wind, because if we don't, if you don't understand the impacts, it's hard to do the mitigation and do the siting.
Mhm.
And it's just such a new field. I mean, wind is, pretty far along in terms of understanding bird and bat strikes, for example, that direct mortality. but still tons of unanswered questions, lots of other taxa that haven't been explored. With solar, it's more about the land conversion. So it's less of a direct mortality issue and more of a what's being displaced or what can then move in and use these facilities. Viewed one way, we're creating hundreds of acres that have no people on them and are fenced in,
Mhm.
and you can actually let the understory grow to a certain extent. And so maybe these could actually be, I'm not trying to greenwash this, but could these actually be good places for certain species, right? If they are looking for a place that is protected and fenced, et cetera, nesting birds perhaps. But the other way to look at it is that you've now created this again, maybe what's could be like a fairly well-managed space, but you put a chain link fence around it. So now mammals can't get through. Not only can mammals not get onto the site, but their movement's been disrupted by this large, fragmenting feature on the landscape. So in order to guide industry or provide suggestions and guidance about how to design these facilities, we have to understand how animals are reacting to them. And that's really my biggest interest is in the wildlife impacts of these facilities. And so I'm starting up a small wind project here in North Carolina, looking at the impacts of wind potentially it's actually being built over forest land, which is really cool because it's a cool co-location, right? You can actually have plantation forests and wind on top of it, which, anytime you can co-locate things, that's a great way to spare land. I'm looking at some other projects looking at how wildlife are using solar facilities. And again, that movement piece, how are animals moving around solar facilities? Another thing we do at the Nature Conservancy is we're very engaged on where should we put solar? What kind of degraded lands should we be building solar on? So if we can put it on cleared land, degraded land, poor soils, et cetera, then it's already conservation win. We're not losing anything. And in fact, we can build something that maybe, again, invites wildlife, is at
Yeah.
least compatible with wildlife. So our Mindlands work is another opportunity to think about how do we move animals around? How do we deal with connectivity, revegetation? So we do engage in that sort of primary research, but what I usually would love to do is partner with the universities because they have, the staff and the expertise and the resources that I don't have a lab, I don't have that sort of capacity at the Nature Conservancy. And so our goal is usually to partner with a really great academic partner. And we kind of bring the project and the connections and sort of the big picture aspect.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Do you get to the field a lot yourself, or are you mostly behind the desk?
It varies with whatever projects I have going on, but yeah, I get out actually a fair amount, and that's been really fun. In fact, that's one of the things I loved about starting this solar work is that back in like 2018 or so when we first started, we were out all the time on solar facilities, just trying to get a handle on it. We're looking at the vegetation approaches, we're looking at pollinator habitat, we're using camera traps to, again, this is where Stephanie and I met was in a camera trapping lab. So always an amazing tool that I'm very happy to deploy. So we've been using cameras. Basic questions, just are animals using these sites? How, where, why? Is the fence a barrier, or there's a type of fencing, wildlife friendly fencing that has larger holes? This isn't rocket science, just a fence with bigger holes, and wildlife will actually go, and it allows like 10 more species to get onto the site, raccoons, skunks, possums, foxes, bobcats. So it's one way to open these sites up to more wildlife movement. So simple things that actually seem to be making a difference. And I think the real exciting part is that if we can propose mitigation techniques that work, yeah, we could be doing this across hundreds of acres as we're building these thousands of acres as we're building these sites across the country.
One of the things that I noticed when looking for jobs, and I hear a lot from people struggling to get jobs, is the experience aspect of it. And especially with a lot of jobs, you'll see like especially for a more manager role, they'll have like project management experience. Did you have a lot of that going into your Nature Conservancy job, or how are you able? Was that required for your job? It sounds like something that they would care about. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So you mean like people management specifically or project management generally?
General, but you can talk about people too.
Yeah.
They always have to has to do with each other.
I think because we tend to hire people, and the word expect isn't quite right, but we trust that people will capitalize on their strengths and find the research and the work that really fits their skill set and their interests, right? So there's a fair amount of selection involved. When I was the director of science in North Carolina, it was clear that my strengths were in forest restoration and wildlife ecology. And so those were the projects I was seeking, the projects I was going after. And that's, what led me eventually to the solar work. So I think you have to be organized in the sense that you have to be able to manage that, like manage your own time, manage your own schedule, and then also be able to go out and find things. Like you're not kind of handed like, here's your workload. It's a lot of going out there and figuring out what's needed and then figuring out those collaborations I was talking about. How do you make those connections with academia, with industry? Of course, some of it I already had just from, working in conservation for a while, but with industry, I mean, that was brand new. I was cold calling people and just making this connection. So I think I'm not exactly answering your question. I mean, there is a fair amount of management, but I'm more maybe talking about initiative and being kind of a self starter. But along with that comes, managing a very busy schedule with a lot of different projects at any
Mhm.
given time. In terms of people management, I haven't managed, I've actually managed more people at my previous role than I do now. But that all I see it less as people management and more of just everything we do is in a very collaborative team setting. So, and even virtually now, my whole team is virtual, but I'm always talking to my teammates. We, meet to talk about strategies to make sure that we're prioritizing correctly. And so the team environment is really important, even though I do then go off maybe and do some things on my own. It's really important to be a good communicator and just be flexible. Sometimes like your priorities, if I bring something to the table, it may not actually be the priority of the whole team. It may not rise up as an important strategy, and that's okay. Part of my job is to say, hey, do we think about this? Like floating solar, I've been slightly obsessed with lately, like what? So this is the idea of putting solar panels on water bodies. Just a new thing for us to think about. Team, we don't have a position on that right now, but this is something, that's going to be growing, we're going to be seeing more of it. And it's something that we just want to make sure we're out ahead of or have a position on or put some thought into before it's sort of upon us. So taking that sort of initiative to find those things and decide what we're going to do about them.
What would you say is like to work for a nonprofit, or what are some things that people need to know going into working for a nonprofit? I know you said the Nature Conservancy is a little bit different, but maybe just even things like funding and stuff that people might not necessarily think about.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a huge learning curve. And you're right, we're large. And so it's a little bit different. We do have a lot of capacity and we have a pretty, for us, it's actually one of the challenges is just sort of navigating the structure. As I mentioned, there's a global level, there's a country program, and I think we're up to like 75 countries. Every state has its own chapter. So part of it is navigating a large organization and figuring out just, how can we communicate without over communicating? How can we make sure we're not
Yeah.
siloed and we're talking to other strategies? So all that's not specific to nonprofits, just sort of, we have about, I think, 6,000-ish employees. And that's, just learning how to navigate that. The funding, yeah, I mean, that was another learning curve. The idea that as part of my job, I would, be somebody who talked to potential donors or current donors to talk about our work. I did a lot of sort of different storytelling, communication trainings over the years. How can we be I mean, clearly, I'm not great at this because I'm a little bit of a rambler, but, how can you, like, tell your story in a punchy way and really get the point across and get people excited and get them energized about our work? And so talking to the, more of the private donors was very new to me. In addition to what I was more used to, which is the typical, grants, sort of fundraising, writing proposals, et cetera. So, I mean, it really is a nice mix of the things you learn in academia about research and then combining it in this sort of, different setting where in my mind, it makes things a little easier because we have multiple ways of generating funding for the work that we do. It isn't, in academia, I feel like, you're very focused on grants, but we have a couple different options
Yeah.
and well connected in some ways where sometimes money flows us through foundations, other places where I would have had no, ability to tap into when I was an academic.
You talked about being a mom a couple of times, and I know that this field traditionally has been challenging for moms. Would you care to talk about that? Like how you made it work as a mom raising two young kids?
Yeah, I love that. And actually, I'm up to three.
Oh, you
So,
have just three?
yeah,
Congrats.
it was thanks. And yeah, I actually really like talking about this. For a while, I wasn't really sure what my stance on this was. One thing I try to convey is that I think maybe, and I'll, the whole Lean In book I know was, by Sheryl Sandberg when that came out, freaked a lot of women out. And I know they've really changed their message these days, so I don't need to keep harping on that. But Lean In had this message of like, you just got to try harder. You can do it all, but you really just have to try harder and put yourself out there and take opportunities and be like a man who doesn't say no to something because they don't have the time. They just do it anyway. I read that book and I think maybe it did influence me a little bit too much at the time because I think the advice I would actually give is, it is really hard. Like there just aren't enough hours in the day and there's a lot to balance. And so find a way to give yourself a break. Maybe you do need to scale back. And as I was saying, for a little while there, I was doing kind of part-time at home, like quantitative work, like, stuff that I would still help my CV and keep me in the game. But I needed to figure out a way to not overwork and not be,
Mhm.
in it for 100 hours a week. And I don't think anybody ever really gave me that message. Like, you need to find ways to find, to balance, to enjoy having kids and enjoy the experience. And you don't want to spend their entire childhood worrying about, do I have enough publications and do I have enough
Yeah.
TV fodder? So, yeah, I don't have exactly an answer, but you do have to give yourself a break and not beat yourself up over the fact that you can't do it all, because I have never found a way to do it all. Now, what I did find though is when I started at the Nature Conservancy, I loved the job so much that I was willing to go a little deeper, to
Mhm.
actually like give a little more of that time. So I think that's part of it too. I wasn't willing to do it necessarily when I was at that big corporate pesticide company. It was too much. Like it just didn't feel worth, what it was taking out of me. But when I was doing something I really enjoyed, it was more of a fair trade. So, but you never solve it. Like I've never solved the work-life balance. Like when you're working a lot, you're shortchanging your kids. And when you're, spending time with your kids, you wonder if you're shortchanging your job. It's really an ongoing thing. But, I will also say kids do get older and it actually gets, for me at least, more fun. I think kids are more fun as they age. And I think
Yeah.
it does easier. So remember that you're not always going to be, in toddler phase making toast like it does. Things do change.
And it seems like the message from your story is that even though you took time off, or time off in quote, you took temporary jobs that didn't hurt your career, that you were able, because I think a lot of women are scared of that, or just people in general. Like even when I work with students and they might not have a job lined up right away. Like a lot of our jobs when we're first starting out are during field season, and it's really hard to get things to line up perfectly. And they kind of stress out about having that gap in their resume. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be a negative thing or affect your career.
Yeah, I mean, that was always the pressure, right? Hanging over my
Hmm.
head. Am I keeping my CV alive? And, maybe I got lucky. You find like working the postdoc again, the projects we worked on together, were really prolific. A lot of, because it was a team effort, we were
Hmm.
able to be a part of this, several papers. So, finding good teams to work on. Like when I was for my first postdoc, I had many papers that were just like me and one other author, and they were just
Yeah.
huge lifts. And so, the more you can collaborate, the more you can lend your skill set to bigger team efforts is great. But yeah, I mean, I think just having, a couple pubs, I don't want to give numbers because I don't really know anymore what's realistic for getting a job, but I think your CV survives better than you think it does. I think if you have consistency, like you're getting a couple pubs out, every year, every other year or so, it really looks good and it shows that you're still in the game. And I think more and more people are understanding. If you say, oh, well, I had 3 kids during this time, I think people are more receptive to that. Like, I don't think we need to hide it the way we did maybe 15 years ago.
Mhm. Are you still publishing papers?
Yeah, now the goal of my job is to have impact in whatever form that may be, in terms of,
Mhm.
conservation impact. But I think publishing is still important as just part of being a credible scientist. And so for me, the challenge has been finding the time to publish within the clean energy space, right? Because a lot of my publications, if you look at them, are still more forest and wildlife related. And so when I made that switch, it's not that I want to, it's not that I want 20 publications on clean energy, but I want a few. I want to show that I'm engaged at that level because I think it's important to my credibility. I think it's important to make sure that I'm still being true to the science and really doing science at that sort of a rigorous level is important to me personally.
Kind of a random question, but on Facebook, I see some posts sometimes about, like, how solar energy won't work or wind won't work, and there's, like, memes about it. What would your response be to somebody who says that it's not gonna work or will never be renewable energy fully?
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't go out of my way to say it's ever going to be 100% necessarily wind and solar. I think that is unrealistic, but right now solar is the cheapest form of energy. So there's an economic advantage to solar energy and wind isn't far behind. So it's, obviously from a clean and a emissions free standpoint, that's the way we want to go. The real challenge with the whole clean energy transition is where are you getting that baseline, the base load, right? So you need a type of energy production that is not going to vary with when the wind blows or when the sun.
Hmm.
And I think that's going to take the longest, and that's what's really interesting right now. And I think I mentioned, as part of my job, what's been really fun is I get to explore all these other types of energy and the questions around them. So geothermal is not all that prevalent right now, but the idea is that it is a dispatchable form of energy. It's a form of energy you would have all the time, not just under certain conditions. And through basically drilling holes in the ground and using either naturally occurring water or pumping water to create steam, you could have pretty small footprints in terms of land use, pretty minimal water use because this advanced hydro is a closed loop, or I'm sorry, advanced geothermal is a closed loop. And you would have this, dispatchable source of energy that you actually can put anywhere. It's cheaper in certain places where you have the right geology. But things like that, like to me, are really exciting.
Hmm.
Like, I don't think it's a matter of when people say it's not going to work. My answer is that we're just at the very beginning. Like, we don't even know it's possible right now. I didn't even know about geothermal like 6 months ago. And I'm like, this to me seems like a game changer. It's not brand new. A lot of people are much further along with that than me. As I mentioned, floating solar, there's the idea of co-locating solar energy with agriculture, right? And so actually having row crops maybe under solar panels, which, again, we're not quite there yet. So there are all kinds of ways that technology is going to make this space even more interesting than it already is. And so I can't imagine why we would give up on clean energy when we've just started.
Yeah. Okay. And last question. What advice would you have for somebody who wants a career like yours? You've already talked about some great things. So if you have anything additional to add, that'd be great. If not, it's okay too.
No, I think that I don't want to, you know, I started off saying, it was sort of circuitous in terms of not originally being laser focused
Hmm.
on a nonprofit or specifically the sort of conservation work I'm doing, and certainly never renewable energy. I mean, that just didn't even exist. Like people who are my age and working renewable energy, that we didn't go to school for that, right? So it's not that anybody I work with around my age is has also learned this on the fly. And they learned it by taking other skills they had and applying it to this new field. And that's really been how all of us ended up where we are. So my advice is, and I mentioned this before, that if you like something, you're probably good at it. If you're good at it, you probably like it. And so maybe you chase the things you enjoy as opposed to chasing an exact perfect role or perfect career that you've sort of envisioned in your mind, but instead saying, I'm going to chase the thing that interests me and see where that leads me. Because like I said, we only know, even as an adult, there are, I'm sure, thousands of jobs out there I've never even heard of, right? So you don't
Hmm.
always know what that end goal is. And I think it's more important to enjoy the process and maximize the process. And then it should lead, I think, to good outcomes.
Yeah, I was really surprised to see you in renewable energy. I was like, "Oh, wow, that's so cool."
That
Yeah,
just happened. Yeah.
yeah,
It all started with wildlife, though. I mean, I consider myself a wildlife ecologist,
yeah,
and I say to solar, or I say to other people within conservation because I'm talking to solar developers, and I've loved working with this industry. They're wonderful, super smart, and most of them are really committed to this climate mitigation. It's not just about making money for some people, certainly, right? But there seems to be a genuine interest in clean energy for climate mitigation. But I tell other people in conservation who are working the space, I'm like, this is conservation 101. This is not super complicated stuff when you're talking about wildlife movement and activity and
mhm.
vegetation management, but it's really important and it really makes a difference. So it's taking our skill set and just adapting it to this new question where I think it's really badly needed. And I think we actually have a lot of potential. Again, in this moment where we have some time to think and maybe plan and get out ahead of it, we have some potential here to really make sure this clean energy transition works for wildlife and for nature.
Yeah,
And for
absolutely. And it sounds like you're still doing a lot of wildlife work, even though it's under a different title.
Yeah, exactly. I've managed to just keep chasing what interests me, and that, tends to be small mammals for the most part.
It all comes back to small mammals.
It always does.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming here to talk with me, and it was great catching up with you. And I look forward to seeing what your career brings in the future.
Thanks, Steph. It's really great to reconnect with you as well. And I really applaud what you're doing here. I'm sure you've
Thank you.
reached a lot of people who, are figuring out their careers. And I hope that these sorts of stories are really helpful to them. But kudos to you
Yeah.
for giving them this format.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a fantastic interview. I love learning about your job and hearing how you were doing. Liz is not huge on social media, but she does have a LinkedIn. So that link is in the show notes. And I love your advice of following your passion and really leaning into that. I would also encourage you to check out my free job tracker and make sure that you look at the jobs that are out there now. What you might find with some experience and with some passions is there are definitely jobs for them, but there might not be as many as you think they are. And it's so important to get the right experience, skills, and education for the job that you want. Today, we talked some about her management experience leading into the Nature Conservancy job. So, if you want a certain job, you might have a vision of what you think it looks like, but you want to make sure you get all of the skills, experiences, and the right education, and as well as build the right network to get you there. So make sure you get the job tracker, and you'll also get on my email list for all of my upcoming events and free trainings. So thank you so much again, and I am so excited to see you here again on the Fancy Science.